Hi, everyone. I wanted to slow down today and really talk about something foundational because this podcast is called Desire and Power. And I don't want those words to just float around as concepts that sound intriguing but stay vague or misunderstood. I want to be very clear right away about what I mean when I use them because most people already have a lot of different associations about what desire and power mean that don't actually match how these forces work in real life. When most people hear the word desire, they often think about sex, impulse, indulgence, or lack of discipline. And when they hear the word power, they tend to think about control, dominance, hierarchy, or someone imposing their will on others. So before I go any further, I want to say this plainly. That is not how I'm using these words here. I'm not interested in desire as something you either give into or suppress, and I'm not interested in power as something you take from other people. I'm interested in desire as a form of movement and power as a form of influence, and in the way that these two forces quietly shape almost everything about how we live, relate, choose, avoid, attach, detach, and make meaning out of. Most people are already living inside desire and power every single day. They're just doing it unconsciously, without language, without choice, and most of the time without understanding why they feel stuck and reactive, resentful, or disconnected. And that's what this podcast is really about. Let's start with desire because it's the one that gets misunderstood the fastest, okay? Desire is not just sexual. It is not just about wanting something you don't have. It is the basic movement towards or away from life. That's what pulls your attention. It's what animates you. It's what makes someone feel alive or interesting, charged or meaningful. You can feel desire towards a person, towards a future, towards an idea, towards a version of yourself, or even towards disappearance and rest. At the end of the day, desire is information. It tells you where energy is trying to move. The problem is that most of us were not taught how to listen to desire without immediately moralizing it, right? We were taught either implicitly or explicitly that certain desires make you good and certain desires make you bad. They make you dangerous or selfish or immature or wrong, right? So instead of learning how to relate to desire with curiosity and discernment, we learn to either obey it blindly or shut it down completely. Now, neither of those responses is particularly intelligent because when desire is suppressed long enough, it doesn't disappear. It just goes underground and starts expressing itself indirectly. It shows up as restlessness or irritability or numbness or fantasy or resentment or compulsive behavior. People start acting out desires that they don't consciously own, and then they feel confused about why their lives don't reflect their values. And this is where desire becomes something that people are afraid of instead of something they know how to be in a relationship with. Now, let's talk about power, because power has an even worse reputation, right? It's usually framed as something external, something only certain people have, something that corrupts, something that needs to be dismantled or feared. But power, at its most basic level, is simply the capacity to affect and be affected. It's the ability to influence outcomes, dynamics, energy, and direction. You have power in every relationship that you're in. You have power in the way that you speak, in the way that you withhold, in the way that you comply, in the way that you resist, in the way that you show up, and in the way that you disappear. Power doesn't only live in dominance. It also lives in passivity. It lives in silence. It lives in being the good one. Sometimes it lives in being the one who never asks for anything, right? But power is always present. The question is whether it's conscious or unconscious. When people say that they don't want power, what they usually mean is that they don't want to be responsible for their impact. They don't want to be seen as selfish or controlling. So they disown their power and then express it sideways through resentment, manipulation, withdrawal, or this one we all know too well, moral superiority, right? There's this place where like desire and power start to intertwine in ways that feel confusing or destructive. And when you don't own your desire consciously, it leaks. And when you don't own your power consciously, it distorts. People end up acting out dynamics they claim to hate simply because they don't have language or capacity for these forces inside of themselves. And one of the things you're going to hear me say very often is that repression doesn't create virtue, it creates fragility. A lot of people are living under the illusion that they are morally superior because they have suppressed certain desires or disowned certain forms of power. But what I see over and over and over again is that repression doesn't make people kinder or more ethical. If anything, it just makes them brittle. It makes them reactive. It makes them afraid of honesty, especially in themselves. When desire and power are unconscious, they don't disappear. They leak. They leak into relationships, into politics, into sexuality, into self-image, into the way that people talk about healing while avoiding anything that might actually disrupt their self-concept. That's why so many people feel like they're doing everything right and then they still feel empty or disconnected, right? They're following the rules, they're being good, they're being safe, but they're not in contact with what actually moves them or how they actually affect others. And that's not a personal failure. It's just a training issue. Most cultures do not teach people how to sit with desire without either indulging it or shaming it. They do not teach people how to hold power without abusing it or pretending they don't have it. So people oscillate between extremes, right? Or they collapse in a numbness and then they try to call it peace. But at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is something else entirely. I'm interested in integration, in learning how to stay present with desire without being ruled by it, in learning how to hold power without needing to dominate or disappear, in learning how to tell the truth about what's moving inside you without turning that truth into an identity or performance. And that's why this podcast will sometimes be erotic, sometimes psychological, sometimes relational, sometimes political, and sometimes deeply personal. Because desire and power don't live in one domain. They move across all of them. You can't isolate them and expect to understand them. Now, in this podcast over time, we're going to talk about how these forces show up in intimacy, in family systems, in gender dynamics, in creativity, in work, in spirituality, and in the body. We'll talk about what happens when desire is split from safety, what happens when power is split from accountability, and we're going to talk about how people confuse control for strength and compliance for goodness, and how much vitality gets lost in that confusion. But I want to make it clear that this is not about fixing you. It's not about telling you who to be. It's about increasing your capacity to notice what's already there, to see your own patterns without collapsing into shame or defensiveness, to recognize when you're alive, when you're withholding, when you're performing, and when you're actually present in this moment. Now, if you're listening to this and something in your body feels familiar or charged or slightly uncomfortable in a way that feels honest rather than alarming, that's usually a sign that we're touching something real here. This work isn't about chasing intensity. It's about learning how to stay with complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. So before we end this episode, I want to ground everything I just talked about in something very personal to me, because desire and power can sound abstract until you actually see how they play out inside a real person's life. And, my story that I'm about to share is not some dramatic story or a shocking one. It's actually incredibly ordinary once you understand what's happening underneath it. Now, for a long time, one of the clearest places I felt desire was in wanting to be dominated by a partner. And when I say that, I don't mean it in an extreme or performative way. I mean that there was something about structure, about clear roles, about being guided that felt deeply relieving and arousing to me. But for years, I had absolutely no language as to why I wanted this or why I had this desire. All I knew is that when this desire existed, it came wrapped in confusion and shame for me. I told myself that I was weird or broken. I told myself I was regressing in some way. It didn't fit the identity I thought I was supposed to have, which was, independent, capable, intelligent, and self-directed. So instead of being curious about my desire, I judged it. The first time I ever tried to name this desire out loud to a partner, he did not react well. He reacted pretty badly. He got super uncomfortable. He didn't know what to do with it. And that moment mattered more than I realized at the time, because unfortunately, I took it as confirmation that this is something that I should not want, something I definitely shouldn't say out loud again. And it made me stop asking. For pretty much an entire decade, I never brought it up with anybody that I was with. I just learned how to keep that part of myself nice and quiet and under the surface. But what's important here is that my desire didn't disappear, right? It just went underground. It lived as fantasy, as tension, as something unspoken that I didn't fully understand, but I also couldn't get rid of it. And because I couldn't understand it, I couldn't relate to it consciously, I could only avoid it, feel embarrassed by it, or keep it contained in my head. And at the time, I thought this was just about desire. What I didn't understand yet is that it was also very much about power. Because in my everyday life, I was holding a lot of power already. Not in some kind of loud or domineering way or anything like that, but in a constant internal way, right? I am highly cognitive, always thinking, always managing myself, always anticipating outcomes. I was used to being the responsible, self-directed, capable woman, right? Power for me looked like control, self-regulation, and holding things together all by myself. So wanting to be dominated felt deeply confusing at first. I thought power only looked one way. I thought that if I wanted to relinquish control in an intimate context, it meant that I didn't really have any power at all, right? I thought it meant that I was weak, dependent, or giving something up that I was supposed to be proud of. But none of that was actually true. And what I eventually realized is that power isn't just about control. Power is about choice. And choosing to put power down temporarily in a consensual, contained, and structured way is not a loss of agency. It's just a different relationship to it. The desire wasn't asking me to disappear. It was asking for relief. It was asking to stop managing everything, to stop deciding, to stop holding the entire structure of myself and the dynamic alone. It was asking whether power could be shared, redistributed, trusted, right? That's a huge one, instead of always being carried by me internally. And once I understood that, everything shifted. And I mean literally everything. The moment I understood the psychology of it, the nervous system piece, the cognitive load, the way that my mind stays active unless it's given clear structure, my shame evaporated pretty much instantly. It was the same kind of clarity that I felt later in life when I was diagnosed with ADHD. Suddenly, things that I was judging myself for just made sense. It made sense that I wasn't broken. My system just worked differently. And once I had that understanding, I stopped fighting it. Understanding transformed the desire, not by getting rid of it, but by integrating it. Once I had language for what was actually happening, I no longer felt wrong or embarrassed. I could hold the desire consciously, and I could choose how and when to express it. And I could see it for what it was. It was just information about how my body and my nervous system seek safety, containment, and presence. And that's what I mean when I say that desire is not the problem. And power isn't the problem either. The problem is not understanding either of them. When desire is not understood, it becomes shadow. And when power isn't understood, it becomes rigid and distorted. And when both are conscious, they stop fighting each other. They start informing each other. Now, I walk around now as an embodied sexual person without shame, and I don't take that lightly. I know how rare that is in today's culture. I know how many people never get to feel at peace with their own desire and their own power. And that is a huge, huge part of why I care about this work. Because desire doesn't need to be erased or conquered or indulged blindly. And power doesn't need to be denied or feared. They just need to be understood together. So when I talk about these concepts, I am not talking about mastering them. I am talking about forces to become literate in, forces you are already living inside of, whether you name them or not. This podcast is simply an invitation to stop pretending that those forces are not there and to start relating to them with curiosity, responsibility, and presence. Nothing more dramatic than that. That's all I want to set down today. So if this language resonates with you, stay. If it doesn't, that's okay too. This work is slow and it's definitely not for everybody. But if you stuck around till the end, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.